Was the Biden White House involved in a censorship for spying scheme? That's what a new Facebook Files drop alleges. The report shows that company executives felt pressure to cave to the administration's demands to censor information, sounds familiar, pertaining to the origins of COVID-19 and also vaccine side effects, in exchange for saving its $1.2 billion per year advertising business in the European Union.
The fresh batch of emails obtained by Facebook Files authors shows Meta executive Nick Clegg directed colleagues to comply because of, quote, the bigger fish we have to fry with the administration, data flows, etc. Here to tell us more is one of the authors, investigative journalist Michael Schellenberger. Welcome back, Michael.
Good to be with you.
So help us understand this pay for play, this exchange here between the United States and the European Union. What was being bartered for what?
Well, so this is very interesting, and this is different sort of conceptually than the censorship that we had been worried about in the past. As you know, we've been worried about the White House threatening to take away what's known as Section 230 liability protections, which give Facebook and other social media companies basically the right to exist. If without it, they wouldn't exist, and that's the basis in which the government has coerced censorship by Facebook and other social media companies, and is a big part of the lawsuit against the government. What we discovered was very interesting. It came out of an email exchange between Nick Clegg, he's a very senior executive at Facebook, a former UK politician, where he said, look, the White House is asking us to censor more. His own people were saying that it was a bad idea because actually it would make people more paranoid or more concerned about the vaccine, I should say, more fairly. That it would actually, if you censored more vaccine information, that people would be more concerned. And the senior Facebook executive said, we should do it anyway because the White House really wants us to do it, and we have bigger fish to fry, namely so-called data flows. Well, we didn't know what data flows referred to, but when we looked into it, we were shocked. It was basically referring to a huge chunk of Facebook's business, about 10% of their advertising business, $1.2 billion a year, something that the EU actually recently fined Facebook over on almost the same amount, which makes me think that they're related in some way. They're trying to protect the privacy of European users of Facebook. That's what the EU's been trying to do. So it's been this conflict. Facebook wanted the Biden administration to argue for the EU to back down on its behalf, and they were clearly willing to do censorship that they themselves disagreed with in order to protect their European business.
Right. So my understanding here, the European Union has, I've said this before, it handles the kind of free speech versus privacy trade-offs a little bit differently, much more in favor of privacy. We at the U.S. have the First Amendment, and we really devolve things in favor of free speech. So the European Union, asserts on behalf of its citizens that, for instance, Facebook can't transfer their data to servers that are outside Europe to a country that has less of a, theoretically, you can understand the justification for it. The European Union doesn't want its citizens' data transferred to some country that has maybe very lax cybersecurity practices or a history of cyber crimes. And for a long while, the U.S. was treated as a safe enough place. And then you can fill me in here if I'm wrong. There were some adverse court rulings, or there was some confusion to that. And what it sounds to me like Facebook was trying to achieve was getting the U.S. government to stand up and say, no, they can send the data here. You shouldn't have a problem with that, or else it's a massive financial penalty.
Yes, and Robbie, by the way, I'm new to the privacy issues, so I am not an expert on it, and you may know more about it than I do. But I think that what you first of all described is super interesting, which it appears that the Europeans historically have been more concerned with privacy, and we've been more concerned with freedom of speech. We see Europeans much more comfortable with restrictions on freedom of speech, and I think we Americans are more comfortable letting our privacy be violated by the social media companies. But there's a different wrinkle to this, which is that 10 years ago this year, Edward Snowden revealed that the U.S. government, working with big tech companies, was spying on all of us, and that it was this was not a conspiracy theory, and that spying was taking place. And the Europeans then reacted against wanting to share the privacy even more, in part because of that. Now, we haven't gotten to the bottom of the story at all, I should say. So there's some things that we don't even totally understand ourselves. But the story gets even weirder because it appears that the Biden administration put pressure on the Europeans around Ukraine aid. And this was sourced by Politico last year. So we're seeing basically multiple things going on. One is that you have a dynamic in the European Union with privacy advocates demanding that the European Union not allow Facebook user data to go to the United States, in part because it appears of the concerns around U.S. government spying, not just corporate invasion of privacy. But then you have this then you have this reaction from the United States saying, really from the Biden White House. I mean, I'm laughing a little bit because it's so outrageous. The Biden White House basically saying is somehow threatening Ukraine aid, threatening the European Union to back down from giving Facebook, preventing Facebook from having its data in exchange for Facebook agreeing to do more censorship at the hands of the Biden White House. So I think
Yeah.
this is beyond the censorship that we've discovered in the past, and we're still trying to get our heads around it. But I think one bottom line here is just that the government had and exercised a lot of different forms of leverage, not just Section 230.
Well, it shows how the government's spying in the past, how its violations of American civil liberties, the U.S. government's, erodes its credibility with other nations. Because effectively, and you're so right to get into the Snowden element, it sounds like the Europeans said, well, we were treating the U.S. like a safe country for data to be stored, but the government spies on its citizens, so obviously it's not. So we're revising that evaluation.
That's what it looks like. And there is, I should say, Max Schrems with Neubs, I believe is the way you call his think tank. It's a strange name. An Austrian activist has done the most work on this. And so we looked at a lot of his work. But I think one final part of the story here is that this remains unresolved, and that the European High Court, basically the Supreme Court of the EU, has consistently sided with privacy supporters in punishing Facebook. I mean, Facebook had a $1.3 billion fine levied against them in May of this year. The Biden EU deal didn't come through until July. And the folks in Europe are saying that this will go back to the Supreme Court of Europe, I should say. We should call it the High Court of Europe just to distinguish it. And that they may very well side with privacy advocates. Now, of course, you also know that Missouri v. Biden has another hearing this week. This is the lawsuit against the Biden administration for violating the First Amendment. That many people think could very well go to the Supreme Court. We certainly shouldn't put all of our eggs in that basket. But we're headed towards a very interesting dynamic where the high courts of Europe is going to be deciding on privacy potentially, and the High Court, the Supreme Court of the United States, is going to be deciding on free speech. That could significantly change social media governance, the role of government, the power of these corporations. So I think we're in for potentially some pretty significant changes going forward. And I think just the revelations themselves, I think, show that I think this kind of behavior is going to be more difficult in the future. At least I hope it will be. And certainly the Facebook files, I think, are as revelatory. I genuinely mean this, as the Twitter files were in terms of exposing these abuses of power.
Well, the framing of this is kind of interesting because when we're talking about Europe, and we're framing it as privacy interests, but what we're really talking about is what we talk about in the United States, to your point, in terms of the NSA spying and government overreach. We aren't necessarily characterizing those kinds of privacy interests as in conflict with our First Amendment rights. We feel very much in the United States that we can very strongly want the freedom to not be surveilled by our government at the same time that we want the freedom to say what we want to say when we choose to say things publicly. So I do think it's worth noting that those things aren't necessarily in conflict, even when we're comparing the European interest and the U.S. interest. And it seems almost like the surveillance aspect of this is in some ways the bigger story. What we're saying, if I understand it correctly, is that Facebook had competing interests. It wanted to continue to have access to the data streams from Europe, which would be precluded by the rights that European citizens have to privacy. At the same time, the US government has an interest in continuing to have access to those data streams for surveillance purposes. Facebook also doesn't especially want to do censorship with respect to this COVID stuff because it doesn't really benefit it financially or otherwise, but because the government also has an interest in promoting its views on COVID, et cetera, it does want Facebook to do that, and then exerts pressure on them to do that. And so it's able to do this quid pro quo, if I'm understanding this right, where they're saying, okay, we're going to help you out and allow you to continue to get access to these European data streams, but you have to do the censorship that we want to do on this side of it. So we see that Facebook has made a decision probably based on its financial interest. It can make money off of the data streams. It doesn't lose or make money off of censorship. Whereas the government's interests are also very much aligned with, I prioritize the data streams because we want surveillance, and also I'm going to get this censorship stuff out of it. So I wonder what you make of that and how to cure choices that Facebook is making like that do seem to be driven largely by the fact the compromises that Facebook is willing to make with the government seem to be directed by the fact that it has more of a financial interest in having access to European data than it loses in censoring content from Americans here at home.
Yes. Well, first of all, Brianna, your summary is exactly right. It's what you said is accurate. Absolutely. And I think the additional, so in other words, the Europeans had an interest in giving into the Biden administration because they were muscled into it. The Biden administration wanted censorship and it wanted the data. And Facebook wanted the data. And I'll add another wrinkle to this, which makes, by the way, the case that there was a First Amendment violation here even stronger. Not like it needed to be any stronger, but it did make it stronger because Facebook's internal people, this is a piece we'll publish today, but its own people were citing this really high quality academic research, which shows that if you censor a full debate about vaccines, you increase vaccine hesitancy. And so that's exactly what happened. In other words, so then the question goes, if it turns out that censoring true information about vaccine side effects or even some misinformation actually makes people more hesitant because you don't have a chance to have the debate and for people to be allowed to make up their own minds. So why did the White House push for that? Why was the White House doing things? And you can kind of go, well, people are stupid, and I'm not going to discount that as a significant factor here. But also they were under a lot of pressure from the news media. So when you look at it, you see the New York Times and NBC, particularly, we see Ben Collins from NBC putting a huge amount of pressure on the White House and on Facebook to censor. And so what you kind of go, it's like Wizard of Oz. You get to the end of it and you rip back at the curtain and you go, really the big driving force for this, I don't want to take away anybody's responsibility here or discount their role, their agency, but one of the biggest driving forces was just the news media demanding greater censorship by the government of their, one could argue their rivals on the social media platforms.
Yes, I think these are all very important dynamics to point out. Thank you, Michael Shellenberger, for continuing to dig into those and for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, guys.